Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you today to the third edition of the Polar Symposium. My name is Jeannie Godula, and I'm so happy to be here with you as the host of this event. The Polar Symposium is co-organized by the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation, the International Arctic Science Committee, represented today by its president, Henry Burgess, and the Scientific Committee of the Antarctica Research, represented by its president, Professor Gary Wilson. Also collaborating in this event is the Oceanographic Institute, Prince Albert I of Monaco Foundation, home to the beautiful building and this beautiful room where we are right now. Now, earlier today, the Institute hosted the pre-event on Antarctic academic cooperation that it co-organized alongside SCAR and the University of the Arctic. So welcome back to any of you who were here with us already earlier today. Over the next few days, the Monaco Polar Symposium will bring together international scientists, representatives of non-governmental organizations, indigenous knowledge holders, and policymakers. Together, we will all focus on the challenges facing polar regions today and their global implications. This year's symposium is structured around three overarching themes: international collaboration in times of uncertainties, funding, innovation, equity, and new models, and from research to action, flagship initiatives and implementation. Today will feature a series of panel discussions introducing each of those three themes. Then tomorrow will be much more hands-on. All of you will be invited to take part in a series of workshops that are designed to move beyond reflection and contribute to the development of concrete action in support of the 5th International Polar Year. Everyone in this room knows the Arctic and the Antarctic are major strategic areas on which the Earth's equilibrium largely depends. And now more than ever, it is urgent to act to protect these already fragile environments. The objective this week is not only to inform IP-Wi-Fi planning, but also to support sustained collaboration and follow-up well after the end of this Polar Symposium. So we're going to get started right away with some opening remarks. As I mentioned earlier, we're being welcomed today in this beautiful Oceanographic Institute of the Prince Albert I of Monaco Foundation, and we'll now hear from the Institute's Chief Operating Officer, Cyril Gomez.
Bonjour à tous, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Welcome to Monaco and welcome, of course, to the Oceanographic Museum of Monaco. It's a pleasure to welcome you in this conference room, which regularly hosts major international events dedicated to the protection of the ocean and the cryosphere. This space reflects more than a century of commitments by the Oceanographic Institute and the Principality of Monaco to advancing science, informing policy, and supporting collective action. Over the years, this room has welcomed landmark meetings and scientific conferences. Among them, in 2019, the presentation of the IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. This venue carries a strong legacy. It has witnessed the engagement of scientists, explorers, and decision makers who, alongside the princes of Monaco, have worked to advance ocean knowledge and protection. It's therefore particularly meaningful to host the third Monaco Polar Symposium in this setting, following the two previous editions held here. Our meeting today also illustrates that although the Oceanographic Institute launched a multi-annual program dedicated to the Mediterranean last year, our long-standing commitment to the polar regions remains firm. Work on the ocean cannot be dissociated from work on the poles. Both are essential components of a coherent and sustained approach. Earlier today, as said Jenny, a pre-event was held entitled Preparing for the 5th International Polar Year, Revitalizing the International Antarctic Initiative. It brought together representatives of key academic and scientific organizations to examine how to strengthen Antarctic academic cooperation in the perspective of the 5th International Polar Year. The discussion highlighted the importance of structured academic collaboration and confirmed a shared interest in reactivating the International Antarctic Initiative. I would like to thank all those who contributed to this constructive work. The Third Polar Symposium, which is now beginning, forms part of this ongoing effort. Its objective is to turn dialogue into shared perspectives and practical outcomes. I am pleased to welcome the co-organizers of this symposium, Romain Sarlier, acting CEO of the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation, Gary Wilson, President of the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, SCAR, and Henry Burgess, President of the International Arctic Science Committee, IASC, who will speak shortly. This morning, Robert Calcagno, CEO of the Oceanographic Institute, presented our Antarctica 2024 Science and Advocacy Expedition, as well as our forthcoming scientific mission to Greenland. I will not revisit all the elements he outlined, but allow me to recall a few key elements. The Oceanographic Institute will once again bring together researchers and private sector stakeholders for this expedition, which will focus on one of the least studied regions of Greenland. The mission aims to improve our understanding on how local ecosystems function, in particular through the study of PFAS and other so-called forever chemicals. These initiatives reflects the Institute's core role, more generally, which is to serve as a platform grounded in scientific research, capable of connecting knowledge producers with those in a position to transform economic practices in support of sustainability. Engaging younger generations remains a central component of our mission. Specific activities are, of course, planned for the young participants joining the Greenland expedition, with the aim of strengthening their understanding of regional challenges and enabling them to become informed advocates for ocean conservation. Through these actions, we seek to strengthen the links between science and the economy in order to advance evidence-based advocacy and foster the implementation of concrete solutions. Decisions in favor of the ocean are regularly being adopted in major international fora, yet their implementation too often remains limited. Public authorities and economic actors are therefore essential to create the conditions for effective implementation. At the same time, investing in the education of younger generations remains fundamental to sustaining this dynamic over the long term. In this context, we welcome the Polar Symposium focus on international collaboration in times of uncertainties, as well as on innovating financing, equity, and new operational models. To conclude, the Oceanographic Institute looks forward to continuing and deepening its cooperation with SCAR, IASC, and the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation. This partnership will be further strengthened this afternoon with the signing of an amendment to the Memorandum of Understanding between our four institutions in support of the polar regions. Thank you for your presence, and I wish you productive discussions.
Cyril, thank you. Thank you again for your welcome here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this symposium is co-organized by the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation, a foundation that's just named its new CEO. We have the honor of welcoming him for his very first speech, I believe. Would you please give a warm round of applause to Romain Sarlier?
Excellencies, dear partners, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the Polar Regions, it's a great pleasure to welcome you today for the third edition of the Polar Symposium, and we're delighted to bring once again such a diverse group of experts to put polar issues at the center of international discussions. I personally believe that action begins in spaces of dialogue, and I'm therefore very happy to see this symposium becoming a recognized and anticipated rendezvous in the polar agenda. Polar regions have been often perceived as distant in the remote places of the world, and this is certainly a reason why they've been kept aside of the heart of the international debates. But today, things are clearly changing, and we're seeing that they are undergoing massive transformations with a growing attention, a growing interest for economic ambitions, geopolitics, strategic, and of course, security reasons. And in this special, very fast evolving context, we need to make sure that environmental challenges are not gradually put to the margins. We need to make sure that any political, diplomatic decision affecting the Arctic and the Antarctic is grounded in very robust scientific and indigenous knowledge. And yet, we have to face a very clear, concrete, and maybe a painful reality. Conservation efforts, scientific research, innovation in the polar regions come at a cost, but these regions remain significantly underfunded. So it raises, in my opinion, two main challenges. Well, first of all, we have to make sure to onboard more funders, and especially private and philanthropic actors, because today, only 10% of the funding originates from these actors. And second, and perhaps more importantly, we must ensure that resources are deployed with maximum efficiency, supporting the most scalable, the most impactful, and the most transformative initiatives. So Monaco is, of course, ready to play its part. We're not a polar state, but yet we have a long-standing commitment in favor of the polar regions. This is rooted in our history with Prince Albert I, and this legacy continues today with His Serene Highness Prince Albert II. It's in that spirit that we created 4 years ago the Polar Initiative with SCAR, with IASC, with the Oceanographic Institute of Monaco. And this initiative is, of course, aiming at supporting science, and we've been supporting early career scientists, conducting groundbreaking research. We've been supporting conservation efforts. But most importantly, this initiative, it is a platform for collaboration. And this is exactly the ambition of this symposium. It has been designed for us to come together and identify the best pathways for a scalable and a coordinated action. So none of this would be possible without our partners. So here I want to warmly thank SCAR and IASC for the guidance. I want to thank the Oceanographic Institute for the constant support and for welcoming this event. Of course, I want also to thank our supporters, and especially Mr. Frederick Paulsen, who is a great polar champion and one of the first supporters of the symposium. And last, but certainly not least, I want to thank our team, our events and scientific team, but more specifically, Salomé Mormantin, the coordinator of the Polar Initiative, who has put so much effort and so much energy in bringing us all together and curating what I believe is a very well-structured and interesting program. So I certainly hope that today and in the coming days we'll be able to come together to originate new ideas, but most importantly, to collaborate and to build partnerships that really endure. So I wish you all a very productive and an inspiring symposium. Thank you very much.
Romain, thank you very much. All right, we will now hear from our representatives from both IASC and SCAR. To start, we'll hear from the president of the International Arctic Science Committee. Would you please welcome with me now Mr. Henry Burgess?
Excellencies, dear friends, thank you for that warm welcome. It is fantastic to see you all here. Thank you very much for being here today. Thank you for your commitment in time and travel and in money. Thank you for being here. A special thank you to our colleagues in the Oceanographic Institute who are hosting us today in this magnificent location. Thank you to our partners in the Prince Albert II and Monaco Foundation. Thank you to our partners in SCAR and our other supporters who have made this event happen. I'm very pleased that IASC, the International Arctic Science Committee, is engaged in a long-term connection with the Prince Albert II and Monaco Foundation, and also with SCAR. I look forward to the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding later on this afternoon. We have funded a lot of work through that memorandum, particularly around the work of early career researchers, so that's a fantastic investment in the future. As I look out today, here this afternoon, I see faces that I recognize from the first meeting back in 2022. And as I walked here this morning from the hotel, it reminded me about that meeting, about the many good things that came from that meeting, but also what was dramatic about that meeting, which was Russia's invasion of Ukraine that morning of our meeting. And as I walked here this morning, I thought about the friends that I had in Russia, and I thought about my colleagues, and I thought about my partners, and the work that many of you will have undertaken. And I imagine that you were thinking the same as you walked here this morning as well. And as we sat there then, we thought about what would happen to the world, and we thought about what would happen to international collaboration. And as we sat there then, and as we sit here now, we know that it can't be the end of international collaboration. Although it's incredibly difficult, it must continue. And it must continue because it's difficult, of course, because of the situation with Russia. It's difficult because of isolationism and nationalism. It's difficult because of climate denial. It's difficult because of the denigration of scientific truth. It's difficult because of the vilification of scientists. It's difficult because of baseless claims to other people's countries. It's difficult because of unwanted advances towards other people's countries. But that's why IPY5 is so important, and it's why this meeting is so important. Because it's hard to keep calm, but it's important to carry on. And that's why we've gone carefully with the International Polar Year in all the time since 2022. We set it up so that it's the international organizations which are leading the initiative at this early stage. And I'm very grateful to the Scientific Committee on Arctic Research, the International Science Council, the WMO, the University of the Arctic, who have all helped us go carefully in these first years. And I'm grateful to many of you who I can see in the audience who are part of the planning group for the International Polar Year. But now is the time to ramp up the activity, and that's part of the reason why we brought this group together again in 2026. So we know that there will soon be national committees that are being set up by each of the countries who want to be involved in the International Polar Year, and those are national committees that can be set up by any country that's interested in the Polar Year, not just because they were involved in the past, but anyone that wants to be involved in the future. That process has already started. We'll have the first meeting of that coordination group in Aarhus in a couple of weeks' time. We're ramping up because we've set up the International Coordination Office program. So there are bids already in to lead the International Coordination Office, and we will know relatively early in the summer, I hope, how that process will be led. And that will give us an enormous impetus and a scale-up ability to deliver on the International Polar Year. In terms of Arctic science priorities, we have the ICARP process, which will determine what the priorities for Arctic science will be over the next 10 years. I know many of you in the room have been involved in that. SCAR will have their own process, the Horizon Scan, which is starting shortly, and I'll let Gary and others talk about that. We know there are also international programs that are starting. Arctic Ocean 2050, Norway's huge investment in understanding what's happening in the Central Arctic Ocean. Antarctica in Sync to create synchronous measurements around Antarctica. Arctic Pulse in Canada. The International Antarctic Institute that we heard about this morning. Japan is creating a new icebreaker, the Mirai 2, which will be dedicated towards international cooperation and research. Those are all concrete, strategic things that are happening sooner rather than later. But although my organization and others like it have been involved in planning the International Polar Year at this stage, it is not our IPY, it genuinely is your IPY. Whether you've been involved in the past is irrelevant. This is your IPY for the future. So if you think that the involvement of early career researchers in international partnerships, the ability to travel, engage, meet new people is important, then the International Polar Year will be for you. If you think that we need major new science initiatives with international partners using new techniques, new approaches, then the International Polar Year is absolutely for you. If you think connecting environmental science and social science together is important, then the International Polar Year is for you. If you think the equitable and empowering involvement of indigenous peoples in science and knowledge systems is important, then the IPY is certainly for you. And if you think societal impact, real-world outcomes and solutions are important, if you think science should speak truth to power, then the International Polar Year is for you. So thank you very much. I look forward to meeting you and discussing with you over the next few days, and thank you again for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. And now would you please join me in welcoming the president of SCAR, the Scientific Committee of Antarctic Research, Professor Gary Wilson.
Kia ora tātou, bonjour, welcome, greetings, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. Thank you also to the Prince Albert II Monaco Foundation for making this possible, and as Henry already spoke to, the partners who have come together. SCAR is very pleased to add its welcome to you all. This symposium is important. It's an important forum for building our connections between our efforts at both poles, not just single poles, and about building a global view. It's also a forum where we can develop our strategic research priorities and strengthen the science policy interface. I've said earlier today, and I'll happily repeat because it's also important, in 2025 and now 2026, we continue to face some significant headwinds. Climate change is advancing unchecked, more rapidly than ever. We are knocking on the door of a 1.5 degree warmer world. And we already see devastating consequences of that climate warming around the globe. Loss of lives, loss of livelihoods, and displacement of peoples. And that is more prominent than ever in the North Polar region. We're also facing some parallel increasing losses of biodiversity. And now we face more nationalistic and increasingly partisan views and responses, or rather lack of responses, to the challenges the globe is facing. So we absolutely need some strategic collaborative solutions that will bring us all together. So no pressure over the next few days. That's what we need. IPY5 is what we hope will catalyse and help develop those collaborative and visionary responses. With respect to that, as Henry mentioned, we have various task forces working to help us develop IPY5, and one of those task forces is working on visioning and priorities for IPY5. And while their work is not finished, I've seen some of their work, and I'd just like to share it with you as perhaps the starting point for some of what we might look at over the next few days. And there we go. I stress, these are my words, they're not their words yet. They're still deliberating and they're still consulting, but this is what I pulled out of a recent presentation and discussion that we were privileged to hear back from them. So we definitely want to see science that leads to action. There's no real alternative. We've had decades of not making that connection. So we want to focus on generating new knowledge that leads to impact and solutions. We would like to see evidence-based narratives that develop trust in science. And I worded this quite carefully because this is really the sticking point for us. How do we engage the non-scientists and their priorities in what we must do? How do we speak the same language? We certainly must address the important issues in a sustainable way. We want holistic rather than linear solutions. Ocean climate and ecosystem monitoring, there is no question that the more we show that things are actually changing in front of our eyes, the more engaging we will be. Broadening the disciplinary engagement in polar regions. If you were here this morning, you'll have heard quite a lot of conversation about transdisciplinary effort and research. And it's true, we can't just be scientists. We must be scientists and politicians and economists and humanists in how we approach this together. We absolutely need a globally collaborative effort. That's partly why we're here. But really importantly, and I spoke to this for those who are in the room this morning, we need to elevate the Indigenous voices. In many cases, they are at the front line and they understand the challenges, needs and responses better than most. And lastly, elevating the new practitioners. So this is their time. Many of us sitting around tables right now won't be here for the polar year. There will be a new generation in place. So that's important too. The other thing I'd like to do is just quietly launch a new report on Antarctic research trends. This was just published. It was finished up last year. It analysed 30,000 peer review papers, publications between 2016 and 2024. And these articles are the basis for the scientific advice to the Antarctic Treaty System. Antarctic research has always been strong, but it is at the moment declining slightly at a time when we can least afford the decline. The other thing that I note from it is collaboration remains strong, but the energy and effort is changing. The landscape's changing, which means the availability and the pathways of the evidence we need is also changing. So we need to be aware of that. But we see this as the evidence which will be the baseline for our new efforts towards IPY5. So with that, I'll happily bring this to your attention. It's available online. I have a few copies, and there will be more forthcoming. It's only just been printed. So with that, let me welcome you all again. We've got a lot to do. Hopefully we've set the scene well enough, and I look forward to the deliberations and conversations. Thank you very much.
Gary, thank you, and thank you to all four of you for those welcoming remarks. So we do have a very exciting program for you this week. We're going to kick it all off right now with our very first fireside chat of this symposium. Now, this is going to take a closer look at the lessons we can draw from past experiences to inform the future and set the framework for all of the discussions around IPY5. So for that, would you please welcome the panelists, Dr. Salvatore Arrico, the CEO of the International Science Council and member of the IPY5 Executive Committee, Dr. Olav Orheim. Olav is a member of the Scientific and Technical Committee at the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation. He's also, here, please come here, Salvatore. He's also the former director of the Norwegian Polar Institute. We have Professor Dali Sambo Doro, Associate Professor, University of Alaska Anchorage, and Human Rights Advisor for the Inuit Circumpolar Council and co-chair ICARP 4. And to moderate this kickoff fireside chat, a woman you all know well, the Polar Initiative Manager of the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation, Salomé Momentin.
It's working. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you here today on the behalf of the Polar Initiative for this third edition of the Polar Symposium. So you've heard from our co-organizer and Jenny that this year's symposium is built around three thematics. They actually follow each other. They are around panel and workshops. So it's an event that you will be working on and hopefully get action and a pathway forward. Those thematics follow a clear progression from collaboration to research, to necessary funding pathway, and to implementation. The aim is to challenge ourselves to think from ideas to action, and actually what legacy we want to leave. And with that, we start with our distinguished panelists here and with you, Olaf. So Olaf, I have some questions for you, and quite a bit. You were closely involved in the 4th International Polar Year as an international planning committees and head of the Norwegian IPY funding office. Looking back to your experience in IPY4, where did IPY4 succeed, creating a long-term impact, and where did it fall short? But most importantly, can you tell us what lesson must be carried forward as we look toward IPY5?
Thank you, Salome. When it comes to the things that we learned from the IPY4, as we now call it, the success, perhaps the biggest success, is that we generated a very large number of new scientists, and we involved many new institutions. APEX, the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists, were formed as a result of IPY. And of course, there were many countries that became active in the polar regions that had not been before. So it broadened the polar family, very much so. And we certainly can call that a success. We failed, perhaps, in realizing how difficult it was to achieve some things. And some things within the legacy were hard to achieve. We didn't achieve everything we wanted in data management, for example. We did not manage to make very many or very large, you might say, flagship programs. We didn't use that term. We used something very different. But terms that indicated that we needed to make a project involving many, many nations to be achievable. We did not do enough of that. And the reasons for that, and some other things that were failed, was that we underestimated the amount of time needed to plan, especially when it involved implementation. We did not have the decision makers on the table. What we did have sitting around in the planning groups were all the scientific people, all the interests, all the you might say, the 1,000 flowers bloomed, but maybe we were not thinking enough about the harvest.
Thank you, Olaf. And when we talk about large-scale international participation, we need to talk about indigenous communities as well. Dali, you are former chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. You're also co-chair of the ICAP4 steering committee. We talked about it earlier. In the context of IPY5, what does meaningful co-design look like in practice for you? But also, how would you define success in that perspective?
Liana, thank you very much for the question, but also allow me to thank the hosts of this gathering for the invitation to share some remarks. In my view, ICARP4 crystallized the human rights norm of direct participation of indigenous peoples. That's a pretty bold statement to make, but I think that it's actually true. We're well beyond the demands of indigenous peoples to participate, and the few examples that I want to draw from, I have some notes here because there are many examples that I think can fuel IPY5 in a good and constructive way. As indigenous peoples, we know that our knowledge undergirds our cultural identity and our cultural integrity, and that it has ancestral strands that are important to our future generations. So we've compelled the change. We've driven the change in my mind. We also know that our worldviews and knowledge have been recognized by international law, and that we as Indigenous peoples do make a significant contribution to the equitable development and the proper management of the environment. Because of this, starting in 2022, myself and a number of colleagues, many present in this room, initiated a dialogue about how do we indigenize Arctic research in the context of the ICART 4. And we were, I think, very successful in a number of different things. The main objective was centering Indigenous knowledge and engaging Indigenous knowledge holders and Indigenous researchers. And through an initiative funded by the National Science Foundation, we engaged more than 100 Indigenous knowledge holders, scholars, elders, and youth to define what indigenizing Arctic research really means in practice. We were able to define frameworks for co-producing knowledge between Indigenous peoples and Western science communities. We also identified some of the structural barriers within research institutions and funding systems that really, in the end of the day, limited equitable Indigenous participation. We also worked to ensure that ICART 4 specifically was grounded in models for research governance inclusive of shared decision-making, Indigenous co-leadership, and ethical engagement principles. For example, I became the first co-chair of an ICART process, and this is significant in terms of shared leadership. We also supported an extensive network of Indigenous peoples across the circumpolar north, and this expansion of participation, in my opinion, empowers a new generation of Indigenous leaders. We were also effective at bringing key Indigenous peoples into international meetings. An example is 20 Indigenous leaders directly engaged in the 2025 ICART 4 Summit in Colorado. A record number of Indigenous peoples at the ICART 4 itself, including participation in the research priority teams that were created under the ICART 4 and by the steering committee and others involved. We also launched the first ever Indigenous pavilion, and it wasn't simply an event space. It was a cultural space, it was an intellectual space, and a political space that became central, not peripheral, to any program of Arctic research that was being conducted. We also collectively prepared an Indigenous people statement that was delivered at the ICART 4 Summit, which addressed a range of different matters, including the importance of equitable recognition and respect for Indigenous knowledge holders, as well as access to funding, and again, a whole host of things. In my mind, again, it changed the trajectory of Arctic research. And I think that it's clear that Indigenous participation is no longer supplementary to research, but there is now the need for, and I think IPY5 in particular, has to embrace and emphasize shared authority, shared methodology, and shared accountability. So IPY5, and I'll just conclude the response to this question with the idea of bringing Indigenous peoples from the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere as a key objective of IPY5 in order to play a direct role and connect with one another, as well as to plan and potentially produce important research that will be beneficial to the whole of the globe, not solely our own communities, but all of humanity. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing with us those success stories. The aim of this Fireside Chat is actually to inspire you all for the next few days, so I think you did that. Thank you so much. Salvatore, now turning to you. The current geopolitical, societal, and scientific contexts are very different for those of IPY4 right now. In your capacity of CEO of the International Science Council, how do you see the role of science play in society today and in the design of IPY5?
Thank you, Salome, and good afternoon, everyone. As part of the Fire Chat, I thought I should launch a couple of provocations. The first one being that a suggestion that we look at polar science and the International Polar Year, the fifth one, as a science diplomacy exercise, and not just as a track to science diplomacy exercise, but I would say almost as a track one exercise, because at the end of the day, science is one of the last universal languages left, and in the world that we live in, which is overly increasingly and overly politicized and polarized, I think we can and help, and we even have the right and the duty to help. My second provocation is that in response to your question, I'm not sure that today we will be able to achieve what the International Geophysical Year has achieved, that is to build the knowledge base that has led pretty much directly to the formulation of the Antarctic Treaty System. I'm not sure that we will be able to do all the good things that the IPY4 did, both for science and also for bringing indigenous and local knowledge to the table. And I'm not sure we will be able to do what, some of this, to repeat some of the success stories in between, for example, the creation of the IPCC. I'm not sure. My third provocation is about the fact that science does not need a policy / societal enabling framework to exist. But for science to thrive, it better benefits from an enabling policy, strong policy and societal framework. And I think Henry said it all when he described the conditions that science and scientists are facing today. So in sum, I think everything has changed, and polar science and the International Polar Year 5, but also science in general, has really the opportunity to rebound to the increasing and overly politicized and polarized word and biased word that referred to, and to really reconsider its role and responsibility within society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now turning to the three of you. Over the next 2 days, we will discuss cooperation, funding, and implementation, with the aim to turn to action. If we reflect on what is most needed today in each of these areas, where can collective efforts make a difference with IPY5? Starting with you, Dali.
Well, I think that I've thought about the three pillars. I think this is a really constructive way to face the reality that we're in. And in terms of the uncertainty, the geopolitical uncertainty, the geostrategic uncertainty, I thought of Inuit. We are essentially living proof that we're adaptable to amazing forces. The fact that we're still here is evidence of that. And I point to this because of the capacity for adaptation. And I've heard others discuss geopolitical resilience, also anticipatory resilience in the context of the present insecurity. And I think that in my view, that the status, role, and rights of indigenous peoples and Arctic indigenous peoples specifically, including Inuit and Sami, that we can effectively, through the diplomacy that we've exercised, help nation states to move forward. And one example is the continued communication between the Inuit across national boundaries, imposed national boundaries, whereas others were stifled the moment that Russia invaded the Ukraine. And I think this is a significant example. We could debate it, but I think it's a significant example. In terms of innovation and funding and equity and funding, I just want to point to a new fund, the Inuit Nunat Fund, which is working to remove the barriers for Inuit and other Arctic indigenous peoples to access funding. And I think that it is a good example of how to remove the barriers, not only for community-led initiatives and self-determination and funding, but for all of the major foundations and philanthropic community out there, which still presently have significant barriers to access funding for indigenous peoples. And the third item, research into action. I'll just point to what I shared previously in relation to ICARP 4, and that is shared authority, shared methodology, and shared accountability. I think that with the direct involvement of indigenous peoples, we too can assist everybody in moving research into action, and especially areas beneficial to our own communities, but they too may end up with results beneficial to many other communities and all of humanity.
Thank you so much. Olaf, Salvatore, someone wants to go? Olaf, go ahead.
We are running short of time, I suspect, but the transnational boundaries, you talked about one group, but more importantly in my mind is science. Science is transnational, and that's why we're all here. And the transnational science that we are doing in the Arctic and in the Antarctic is going to be very, very important. And we have now, when we're planning for IPY5, the challenge of making that science and those plants robust enough. And that's picking up on what Salvatore said. We are living in a very, very complicated world at the moment. And it's not for this body to say where the world will be in 5 years. We will not be able to do that anyway, even if we tried. But we have then to know that we have to make our plants robust enough to handle various different situations, depending upon what happens on the higher levels. So I think that's the challenge for us. But it makes it somehow more interesting to make sure that we make plans that will work, whatever the situation is, ED in the Arctic, for example. And I'll just make as a final point, the previous IPY, we had Russia with us as a very strong cooperative partner. And they changed their rules for customs, for example, for IPY ships, had special leniency in how they were treated, etc., etc. There were many things that were actually initiated by the IPY process and made things better. Now, of course, other things are taking place, but let's hope that the IPY5 process maybe also has political positive impacts, just the same way as the IGY did way back. That would be very nice if we could do that.
Yes, so in response to your point, to your question, Salome, I wanted to sort of pick on some of the points made by Gary, and namely the fact that we really have, with Polar Science and the IPY5, the opportunity to pivot the science model And to do that by walking the talk on transdisciplinary science. And I think the most significant contribution that the IPY5 and polar science in general can bring going forward is really to focus on how you design, you co-design the questions. Not just on the what, but on the how, and how you co-produce knowledge, and therefore, which in turn has to lead to solutions. So there really is an opportunity in that context to, as I said, pivot not just the science model, but also to educate the next generation of polar sciences in that direction, which is very much reflective of the need to mainstream transdisciplinarity into science, including polar science. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, please join me to thank our distinguished panelists here for setting up the scene of the Polar Symposium. Thank you, all of you, all 3 of you for that. I hope it inspires you. And with that, I give it to Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. Salome, thank you so much as well to you. Well, it is very inspiring to hear some of these stories. Hopefully that will get everyone a bit more motivated for the next few days. But we all know the good comes with the bad, right? And the world really is at a crucial juncture right now. There's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of concern, there's even fear about where we are right now, where we're headed. So we're going to take a closer look at that right now with this panel. This is going to focus on international collaboration in times of uncertainties, like the times that we're in right now. This is a theme that will be further explored tomorrow during the workshop, but for now we're going to hear from our distinguished panelists. So would you please welcome with me on stage His Excellency David Balton, Senior Fellow at the Arctic Initiative of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Also with us, Dr. Antje Boetius, President and CEO of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. Hello, please take a seat here. Dr. Anil Mishra is with us, Chief Hydrological Systems, Climate Change and Adaptation Section at UNESCO. Dr. Sarah Olsvig, International Chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. Dr. Bukru Ozoy, Director at the Tubitak Polar Research Institute and Vice President for Capacity Building at SCAR, and the moderator for this session, the Director and Founder of the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, Pam Pearson. Yes, if I can have you all sit. Sarah, where's Sarah? Yes, Anil, you're here. Pam, if you can be at the end. And Sarah, you're right here. There we go. Everyone's in their place. Excuse me. All right, Pam, I will let you take it away.
Now can you hear me? Good. So thank you everyone for being here. And I wanted to refer back also, as others have, to Henry's, before we get into it with the panelists, and take it back even a little bit further. Because if you look at Arctic and Antarctic research, for hundreds of years, really, there was a period where geopolitics dominated and science was incredibly nationalistic. These were also periods of sometimes horrifying abuse and exploitation of indigenous peoples in the Arctic. Starting then in the 80s and 90s, we began to see more collaborative research, which I think is what most of us can kind of remember. And in that context, around 2000 or so, climate change really began coming into this, and the previous IPY really caught that and really moved forward science in a time of climate change. And I would say that focus, especially on climate change, takes us to the ruptures of today, where again, geopolitics seems to be dominating, but it's a very different world right now. And it is really ruptured geopolitics. We're not in transition. This is a time of rupture. It's a time of not just questioning, but at times twisting of the science. And it's a time of climate change affecting both poles in a way that could affect not just the poles, but all latitudes for millennia going forward if we continue on our current pathway. So in that light, I wanted to turn to our panelists and talk about this time. I would say uncertainty is really downplaying what we're looking at. These are really, in many ways, dangerous times, but dangerous times can be times of opportunity as well. So I wanted to turn to Dr. Olsvig first, actually, as the only resident of a polar region on this panel. and ask you, from your long time position as an Indigenous leader, how has this really disrupted science policy landscape already affected or harmed Inuit? And what scenarios do you see developing in the future?
Royana, thank you so much for the invitation to this magnificent symposium. Once again, it's good to be here and good to be in a room with many good friends, friendly allies and others. I am from Galatlit Nunat, Greenland, so I want to say that the rupture we are seeing right now and the geopolitics of the world are very tangibly affecting us. Everybody knows that. You've followed the news. We currently wake up every morning thinking, what will happen today? How will the day look? We have at our office at the Inuit Circumpolar Council Chair's office had to lock the door simply because so many reporters are roaming the streets of Nuuk and they see a sign saying Inuit and they want to go and interview us without any previous appointments. But that is not only bad. And that is what I want to make as a point in this first round, that we are seeing, first of all, something that both resembles but also is so different from earlier times of geopolitical tension and competition. We are seeing how we are building further on previous and former indigenous leaders' work in terms of ensuring that we as indigenous peoples are recognized, that we have institutions that we've built ourselves, also knowledge production institutions, universities and so forth, that we have instruments in this world through international law that recognize our existence, our inherent rights that are there no matter if they've been written down on paper. And those times are often forgotten when we see the mainstream media talk about the current geopolitical development. It is as if any media coverage currently can, just with one stroke of the pen, risk to erase all of that. So my point is that we have to, in this moment, in no way risk downplaying what we had already built. In no way risk putting ourselves in a situation where we are sounding as if what we already built is already torn down, because it isn't. We've heard clearly, and of course in Davos last month, state leaders spoke of the rupture. We saw very clearly during January, the further development of Galatlit Nunat, Greenland, becoming a symbol of the rupture that the world leaders are talking about. And immediately I think that what needs to happen among us as scientists, as leaders, is to think about, especially for the Arctic, how do we find and how do we identify the common interests we have in that big sort of pool of contradictory interests? Because they are there and they have been there before. And secondly, how do we bridge the rupture? And Professor Daly Sambodoro spoke to it already, that we as indigenous peoples have deliberately chosen not to cut the ties. In the Inuit Circumpolar Council, we saw in January, again, our fellow Inuit in Chukotka stating very clearly their support for Galatlit Nunat, calling on our region, the Arctic, to continue to be a peaceful region, calling on our right of self-determination to be upheld. The same from our fellow Inuit in Alaska, and of course in Canada and Galatlit Nunat. So what we've seen in the past month, as hard as it has been and as tired I might look, because it's been very, very long work days for all of us, and especially of those who work in the government of Galatlit Nunat, and then also us at ICC. I've also felt some strength and some reassuring, or what do you say in English? Reassuration? No. Reassurance that we are not alone in this world. And that reassurance has come about through the statements of support for Galatlit Nunat, Greenland, from states. That's usually what you see in the media. But not only from states, from indigenous peoples from all over the world, from institutions, and how we have felt that very tangibly, being that people, very few in numbers, as a reassurance that we are not alone, that there's hope in terms of finding, and state leaders spoke to that, finding common values, a common foundation in spite of this rupture that is happening. And I think no matter how we twist and turn it, the science community, the knowledge production community at large, still and will continue to carry a very big responsibility in that sense. Because much of what we have already experienced has also been driven by knowledge production, driven by the biases, driven by the inequities in power balances when it comes to knowledge. And it was spoken about in the previous panel as well. And to me, this is really something that makes it so crystal clear what responsibility every person here in this room carries, be they indigenous or not. We've seen how important allyship is in these months and how quickly things can change, but also that a change that we were already seeing coming, now that it's here, it also plays out with new dynamics. And it's those new dynamics that we have to be able to grasp in this very moment, also in terms of science cooperation, knowledge production, and so forth. So I'll keep it there for now.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Bolton, I wanted to turn to you next. Remaining in the Arctic Council has been viewed really as a model for promoting international collaboration, but it's struggling now. And I'm wondering if you think the Arctic Council can weather this storm, and if so, how?
Well, thanks very much, Pam. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the Foundation for inviting me. A few minutes ago, Sarah Olsvig said that people in Greenland wake up each day and wonder what's going to happen today. Sarah, it may not make you feel any better, but you're not the only ones who wake up each morning and wonder what's going to happen today. And I bet that people working in the Arctic Council process may also wake up each morning wondering the same thing. Yes, the Arctic Council is struggling and has been. There are, I think, two main sources of headwinds, one flowing from the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the ongoing war there, which just entered its 4th year, but also the policies and number of the actions of the second Trump administration, particularly as they relate to climate change, which is a big part of what the Arctic Council does, but also, frankly, having antagonized a number of the allies that the United States have in the Arctic, makes it harder to cooperate in the Arctic Council process. Those things said, though, the Arctic Council is not dead. It is continuing to work. There are a number of people affiliated with the Arctic Council here today. And just today, an article I wrote on this appears, you can look for it yourself, Revitalizing the Arctic Council. Harvard Belfer Center published it today. It's on the web. And here are some of the recommendations we have for keeping the Arctic Council afloat in difficult times and in hopes of better times to come. We would like to see the working groups, which are only able to meet now virtually, resume meeting in person. That may be hard to achieve in this moment because it does mean accommodating Russian participation where these working groups meet. But as we speak, there are dozens of international organizations, multilateral bodies, where Russian diplomats get visas to come, the United Nations, all its specialized agencies, many other places I could name. Why is the Arctic Council held to a different standard? Second recommendation has to do with increasing support for indigenous participants. What separates the Arctic Council, in my mind, from many other fora like it, has been the engagement of indigenous peoples of the Arctic represented as permanent participant groups. It is also true that these groups struggle with financial and other resources, and the support for them coming from the outside, including from the member governments, has never been adequate. This might be a time to increase such support. The permanent participants are part of what make the Arctic Council legitimate, authentic. They bring to bear the experience of peoples who actually live in the Arctic and have lived there for thousands of years. The working groups are operating under a number of strictures, but there are also some silences in those strictures, silences in the guidance that can be exploited to try to do as much as possible under current circumstances, particularly through using tacit approval as a way to get projects completed without necessarily having to ask affirmatively, is this okay? Just do it until you're told not to. There are more diplomatic ways of putting that, but I think you get the point. This would be a good time for the Council to do even more than it has done in the past, engage with other intergovernmental bodies, other international institutions, I ask for one, to help carry some of the work forward at a time when the Council is not operating under full capacity. Two more. This would be an excellent time also to do what has been done in the past, but is, say, even more necessary now, increase coordination across chairships. The Danish chairship is coming up on the first of 2 years. Next will come Sweden, next will come Canada. Though the leaders need to be talking, I know they need to talk more to try to think about a vision forward. How do we carry ourselves beyond the current difficulties that we face? And last but not least, Pam, for all the challenges, we need to keep Russia as engaged as possible. Without Russian engagement, it's really hard to get a lot of the work done in the Council it needs doing. And there's always a risk that Russia will walk away from the Council, as they have walked away from other bodies and other connections. We do need them at the table, as difficult as that is to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Obviously, there's a lot of focus these days on the Arctic, but I wanted to turn now to Antarctica. Dr. Osoy, how do you see Antarctic science faring in a time of focus elsewhere and also in this time of geopolitical rupture?
Thank you, Pam. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for putting this wonderful event together. And it's a great pleasure to join this panel. I would definitely avoid this as Arctic versus Antarctica, because the climate system doesn't work that way. What happens in Antarctica and Southern Ocean shows up globally through sea level rise and risks, ocean circulation, and ecosystem change. So when political attention shifts north, Antarctic science doesn't become relevant, less relevant actually, even it becomes more important to keep it visible. In other words, Antarctic science is not a niche agenda. It is actually part of the core climate dashboard. One Earth system, 2 poles, and 1 set of risks. I have very recently returned back from Antarctica. The reality is simple. The message is simple. No one can do this alone, because there are issues like safety, logistics, environmental standards, and basic access to the field sites. What, again, very recently I witnessed is that despite geopolitical uncertainties, scientific collaboration in Antarctica is still continuing, often very successfully. The question is how we protect the conditions that allow that cooperation and collaboration to remain reliable and science-driven. Well, Antarctica is a very unique governance space. It is dedicated to science and peace. Many countries run stations side by side, well, under the shared environmental harsh conditions. So this operating system is quite a good proof that can enable cooperation even in difficult times. Of course, this needs predictable access, transparency, and trust in science. On how, coming back to, again, the last part of your question, that how Antarctic science is faring, I would say it is resilient, but of course the stress shows up, especially in funding, mobility, permitting, data sharing. And the immediate, actually, task is not only producing excellent science, but also protecting environment, safe collaboration, scientific freedom, and open exchange. Open science and open data are stability tools. Open data keeps the system honest, and also capacity building. That is the human infrastructure in polar science. There are early career scientists trained in polar methods, logistics, and science to policy communications. So we have a very broader participation. Gary already mentioned this, but this is where SCAR's role becomes very concrete. SCAR's strategic direction is centered on coordinating international Antarctic science and providing independent, evidence-based scientific advice to the Antarctic Treaty System and other policy processes.
Thank you. And that's a perfect jump to Dr. Boetius now, because as was said earlier, this is a time of declining research budgets, and yet at the same time, Antarctica in many ways, especially when it comes to sea level rise, has greater uncertainties and greater threat for the planet, really, than any other region in the world, even though most people will never see it. So I wondered if you could comment on how you think we can hold that tension right now and continue the research that's just so vital moving forward to policy.
Yeah, it seems coming as a great surprise that it is really so that global research budgets decline for polar research at a time when we know that knowing the future, minimizing risk because we better understand what is happening, how we are already committed to a future that no Homo sapiens has ever experienced, how this is possible that there is a de-investment in research. At the same time, there is such an international science spirit of collaboration with all the new technologies that quickly translate languages and writings in all languages, that let us share data better than ever, that have this huge mobility between scientists, or at least the willingness if they would get visa. So it's a strange time, and what I can say about this point of view to talk with others, I have to tell you two small anecdotes talking to military. You might be surprised why that. At the Arctic Circle in Reykjavik, I was really surprised by an Indian admiral summarizing his fear and risk assessment in words I first found cynical. He said, like the few past 100 years, human conflict has come and has gone, but he fears the ever-accumulating destruction of nature because the worst would be at war with nature. And that's very simple, very militaristic words, but if you translate it, it is this unknown that we step into. And just look at the last winter. It is exactly that winter that meteorologists and ice researchers have described as a possibility, though they thought a statistical possibility we would see something. We just saw the polar vortex weakening and slacking, the ice-cold air moving to places that never saw that amount of snow, places where there was no concept of avalanches. At the same time, heat waves, unbelievable heat waves and droughts, all of that happening at the same time is just one example of how the future could be built if we wouldn't find solutions. And so what is needed, of course, better and more science, more collaboration. We've discussed it the last few days, and I think that, as the Admiral said, this moment of destabilizing research will soon be past, because we also know from human history those that invest in science will be the winners. It is a proven fact. And those that run forward to having more polar infrastructure, knowing ocean, knowing weather, knowing biodiversity, which is a huge change that we are seeing right now, they will be the winners. And so it sorts itself out over time. We are not patient enough to wait for this destructive approach to science funding. We can work together to fill the gaps for some amounts of time, but I tell you, it is a dear situation with potentially the Global Carbon Observatory, Argo, Gold BGC floats being decomposed, and many other issues. So while I know that this is the apocalypse panel and we have to look for solutions too, I can only say that we just have to work harder to fill the gap of decreasing research funding. And yesterday and this morning, we have already thought about new ways of increasing collaboration rather than decreasing.
Thank you. That's a bit of a note of hope, because of course time is the one thing that we do not have on our side right now. I wanted to turn now to Dr. Mishra, because of course the UN also is under stress these days. How can the UN system, and I guess specifically of course UNESCO, contribute especially to IPY or to raising polar science to policymakers?
Well, let me take this opportunity to thank organizers. In time of uncertainty and in time of the challenges, and as a student of hydrology, we are somehow designed to address uncertainty. And if we also look back, everything is changing and constant in the change. So just previous speaker says, if you join these two notions, uncertainty and everything is changing, we call in hydrology, stationarity is dead. What does that mean? That means that past is no longer relevant to future prediction. You need to identify, you need to build resilience based on the contemporary data, based on the present condition, and your parameters will be set out by that. Of course, we are facing challenges now. And coming back to this Polar Symposium, this is the third series of Polar Symposium. I'm first time attending this, but I see the huge opportunity not just to connect Antarctica and Arctic, but the whole cryosphere, bringing all the community together, understanding, and then trying to develop synergies so that all the system is connected, and that can provide really resiliency in this time of uncertainty. So as I heard from previous speaker, but also from the SCAR, how to make science relevant. The decade of action for cryospheric sciences, if you look at that resolution or the title of that decade of action, so we need to build action based on cryospheric sciences, meaning that we need to invest in science, and as previous speaker highlighted, but also to understand the knowledge that already exists from indigenous community. And I really support that open science is the tool, the transparency that really provides opportunity to validate, calibrate, and engaging citizens. I think all these tools will make us more resilient. And that's why probably United Nations only science-mandated education organization was asked to lead the decade. And I would like to invite all of you to contribute. This is a shared responsibility, shared vision, and our really, we need to come up with actions from this decade. And I think the preparation for the IPY can already provide, and we can work hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and of course, Anil is a representative in a sense also of the third pole here, which is important in moving forward to IPY also. We have a couple of chairs empty here because of too much snow on the East Coast. My understanding is that Greenland is in an incredible snow drought right now. But I wanted to ask, as we move forward towards IPY, or towards the decade of action on cryospheric sciences. How can this community best ensure that indigenous concerns and contributions are included? And sort of specifically, there are two models out there, and I'm wondering which of those has worked best in your experience. Is it incorporation of people from indigenous communities in the science, or is it better to have parallel communities, parallel committees that ensure that and feed into it, or is the answer all of the above?
I think that you cannot separate those two things. As peoples, indigenous peoples, we also have our representative institutions and organizations. We have our own processes, we have our own decision-making processes and so forth. And I think this also falls very much down to governance and research governance being a mirror of governance at large, being responsible towards ensuring the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples at all levels. And I think that's where, of course, the Arctic Council is a very, very good example. Inuit Circumpolar Council and the Sami Council and the then Organization of Russian Indigenous Peoples of the North co-founded the Arctic Council. And prior to the establishment of the Arctic Council, there was already dialogue and demands on the table to have indigenous peoples at the table at all levels of decision-making in the Arctic Council, not only in the knowledge production part. And I think that is, as Ambassador Bolton said, one of the successes of the Arctic Council. And currently, we as indigenous peoples are doing what the states cannot. We are the ones meeting in person, keeping the door open for meeting in person. We are the only ones who have true circumpolar meetings with the senior Arctic officials chair, so the chairship of the Kingdom of Denmark. A new meeting format established by the Norwegian chairship, now also continued by the Kingdom of Denmark's chairship, led by Galashlitnunat Greenland. So we are demonstrating again, like we did prior to the establishment of the Arctic Council, long before that, that indigenous peoples want circumpolar cooperation, that we want people-to-people cross-border cooperation. And now we are living it in this difficult time. And so I think that it's important to really consider very carefully in each institution that you represent or in your own projects to not have indigenous peoples as an add-on or an afterthought, but actually also consider us as strategic partners, not just in terms of how to navigate the geopolitical turmoil that we are in. That there we already are a strategic partner to the states who want to continue the Arctic Council work, and they all do, which I really applaud. But also as those who can contribute and already contribute in terms of defining what is relevant to know, what is relevant to ask in terms of research questions, research projects, where do you spend the money best? And remember that all of those processes are inherently, unfortunately, still full of inequities, full of systemically discriminating against those who are not that many in numbers or who do not have the big money in their organizations. So continuously think about those mechanisms that lie within the institutions. Finally, I want to repeat something that I said at the ICARP, where I was not able to be there in person, but I delivered a video speech. And that is to remember the role of research in colonization. This has also become very evident in the past year and the past months. Our response from the Inuit Circumpolar Council already a year ago in terms of what is happening to Galashlitnunat is there is no such thing as a better colonizer. And we have repeated that so many times, it starts to sound like somebody called it the quote of the year or something like that. But really think about what that means. Think about that we still have so much work to do within each reality of the states and within each reality of the institutional mechanisms that we work on the basis of. And none of that change will happen if we all go automatic gear. It only happens when we fight, when we are perseverant, when we know our rights, when we know our way to the table, when we recognize that indigenous peoples are equally supposed to be at the table in decision making, and unfortunately we are still in a place where that doesn't happen automatically. So that's why I'm saying we need allies, and we need everyone here in this room to take that leadership and be that leadership to ensure that indigenous peoples are fully and effectively included.
Thank you. Ambassador Bolton, I'm sorry to put you on the spot a bit right now, but a bit of an elephant in the room, if you can comment on this. How do you see cooperation on polar issues developing over the next few years from the United States? We've seen a couple of icebreakers retired. And so where do you things going if you have a bit of a crystal ball?
So not everything is broken. Let's start from that. There's a lot of good work being done, including by the US government, that doesn't make headlines, that is continuing. And there are things we can build on. And here's one international example of something we can build on in which the United States is involved. The Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, a 10-party treaty that entered into force 5 years ago. It prevents the commercial fishing from starting in the Central Arctic Ocean for at least another 10 years. The parties are meeting, including China and the United States, Japan, Korea, Russia, EU, Iceland, Canada, Norway. And it has a science program that is being built. And it has indigenous participation and indigenous knowledge incorporated. There's a lot that's good there that can be used as a model moving forward, including to address new threats to the Arctic. So Sarah mentioned one really good quote: "There's no such thing as a better colonizer." I can remember, everybody remember Al Gore? Used to be the future president of the United States. He liked to say that political will is a renewable resource, and I think that's something also to remember here, that, yeah, the United States is still a participatory democracy. The things that we see happening today are not necessarily the things that will happen between now and the beginning of IPY. There is a better future possible.
Thank you. And looking just a little bit closer in time, Dr. Osoy, of course, Turkey is going to be the COP31 host. And at the same time, for those who aren't aware, Australia is sort of co-president in charge of the negotiations, and of course has a very strong Antarctic program. So what kinds of things might you see coming out of COP31 this year?
Well, COP meetings are quite an unusual and powerful setups. And Turkey is going to host the 31 meeting this year in Antalya. And Australia is going to be leading the negotiations. So actually, what I believe is that this can be quite an advantage if we use to bring a stronger cryospheric science into the agenda, especially into the core of COP. Not only as a side event, because as you know, it's quite a busy meeting, COP itself. So we can at least have the opportunity to translate Antarctic science into messages that negotiators can actually use to clear risks, clear indicators, and clear implications for mitigation and adaptation. So as host country, Turkey can help convene and connect as bringing polar scientists, climate negotiators, and implementation actors into the same conversation, and do it with an action orientation. So we can at least emphasize also capacity building, supporting early career scientists, researchers, strengthening institutional partnerships, and making sure polar science is translated into usable products. And Australia's role in leading negotiations can help mainstream Antarctic and Southern Ocean science into core negotiation narrative, especially on mitigation pathways and long-term risk management. So if the cryosphere, as it's already mentioned here, is treated as a central indicator of success, it strengthens the credibility of COP outcomes. But I see some, well, the COP has some fragmentations. So there are many voices, many opinions, many events, not much shared baseline. So therefore, polar science can do better by speaking through common indicators and shared assessments. If we align, I guess this is quite important, around a small set of key signals, it might be, this is just an example, of course, it might be sea level, ocean change, ecosystem impacts, whatsoever the subject is, of course, we can definitely increase impact and reduce noise.
Thank you. And I can say, as the organizer of the Cryosphere Pavilion at COP since 2019, that's music to my ears, because all too often people come and say, oh, I'm doing a side event, and that's why they're there. No, if that side event doesn't feed into the policy, it's not worth coming. Dr. Boyetsu, I wanted to ask you, because of course we've had a lot of focus here on cryosphere, but what connections would you see between the Arctic and the Southern Oceans that might be important to draw at this time and in IPY?
Yeah, I would give an answer from physics, and that is, of course, the ocean that links the polar regions. And so when you simply think about the whiteness, the albedo question, the question of interaction between cloud, ocean, and ice, it rings to you that it's not all about waiting a few hundred years before the sea level rise moves so high that it is really a problem for most of the people on Earth. It starts much earlier with extreme weather patterns, as we have said before. It starts with changing, as you said, also the mountain cryosphere, where 3 billion people are connected to. But I'm a biologist, and so I have to alert you also that what we know about life on Earth is that temperature is the key effect, the key regulator of evolution, of diversity of functions. And so the fact that IUCN has now founded a working group on survival of microbes should alert you. That is like scary if we think that even unicellular life that has been there for 4.5 billion years is now under pressure and might be lost, especially snow microbes. There is also the connection, so only not life, but really what the ocean currents do to connect cryosphere, to pump oxygen to the deep sea, to bear life that is globally connected. And I only say whales, for example, or birds, and then all of it, bring it all back to humans. We are connected. It tells you that, yes, as you said in the beginning, we are one planet, and the cryosphere has always been part of our evolution. And as Sarah very quickly mentioned in the beginning, the history of humanity and its connection to ice, we are only discovering it from the science-centric anthropological perspective, but we do have to understand that the filter between all the human species that once lived on Earth and us as a survivor, Homo sapiens, was the ice ages and the question of their velocity and change. So we are evidently permanently connected to the ice.
And I was wondering also if you could say a word about this role that both these oceans play in terms of carbon drawdown, because it's an essential ecosystem service, but it's damaging the oceans too, isn't it?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we have this positive feedback mechanisms that confuses people often when we say it. So positive sounds great. There is a feedback that makes us better, healthier, richer. But when carbon flux people speak about positive feedback mechanism, it means like everything is accelerated if you start on one screw. The ocean takes up the majority of the CO2. In fact, the Southern Ocean takes up most of all ocean CO2. And when we warm it, we weaken that link. It's a matter of research at this time, but we do have to understand that it has started much earlier than Industrial Revolution that we have weakened the carbon link. Again, it connects us to deep knowledge of human cultures. At the moment that the whales were deleted from the planet in their original abundance, we have started weakening the carbon link. Today, we are weakening the carbon link even further for the physical law that if you warm water, it will not store gas very well.
Thank you. And because that's something that's all too often not considered. So Anil, as the cryosphere person, you get the last word. And I wanted to ask specifically what connections you can see concretely between IPY and the decade of action on cryosphere sciences. And thank you for keeping that word action in there.
Well, I think, first of all, on 14th of August 2024, France and Tajikistan, with other 64 countries, supported to pass the resolution Decade of Action for Cryospheric Sciences. So we didn't really have a time to prepare, but there is an opportunity with the community from SCAR, from IX and others. We were able to identify 5 overarching challenges. I'm not going to go into the detail because I'm seeing there is a time restriction to this session. So we have identified 5 overarching challenges, and I think it can go hand in hand with IPY. So I would like to invite IPY community, and you, all these organizations are already in the management committee, to be part of the working group. If you Google UNESCO Cryosphere Decade, there is a call for expression of interest for the 5 working group, plus Finance Dialogue, Cryosphere Alliance, and Indigenous Advisory Committee. We need to work together. As I said, it's a shared vision and collective responsibility, ladies and gentlemen. And I would like to invite you to discuss in Paris, UNESCO headquarters, 18th and 19th March, to discuss all the process, how we can work together, IPY and Decade of Action for Cryospheric Sciences.
Thank you so much, Anil. And I wanted to thank the entire panel. If I could ask everyone to thank with a round of applause the Apocalypse panel, which I think is also a panel of hope.
Thank you so much. We are going to take a quick coffee break. I just want to point one thing out before we do. Keep your eye out for Grace Cordson. Grace, where are you? Grace is right here. Can everyone see Grace waving right there in the corner? So Grace is an early career polar researcher. She's a climate communication specialist. She's going to be recording a series of short interviews for social media throughout the symposium. Now, we all know how important it is to get the word out about what's happening right now, and Grace is going to help us do that. So if some of you could take a few minutes to answer her questions, we would greatly, greatly appreciate it. We're going to take a very quick coffee break. If everyone can be back here at 4 on the dot, that would be fantastic. Go enjoy.